Listen closely, because this is not the kind of story you were ever supposed to hear. Picture a church filled with polished oak pews, chandeliers glowing with a pale, flickering light. A bride dressed in white lace, radiant in the way only youth and promise can be. Dozens of guests leaning forward to witness vows that would bind two families together forever, and then silence, shattered by a sound no wedding should ever hear. A choking cry, a convulsion, a body collapsing at the very altar of God. The young bride writhing on the stone floor, foam spilling from her lips, her voice straining to whisper, "The wine, it burns." That was Hartford, Connecticut, 1842. And what followed was a secret so disturbing, so corrosive to the social order of its time, that newspapers refused to print the full account, because the killer wasn't a shadowy stranger lurking outside the church, it was family. And she sat among the guests, calmly watching as her victim died. But this is not only the story of a mother-in-law who poisoned her son's bride. No. What you're about to hear is something deeper. It is the anatomy of obsession, control, and the darkness that festers when power is threatened. It is a case study in manipulation, social paranoia, and the lengths to which institutions and families will go to preserve their image of superiority. Men, understand this now. History doesn't just record events, it records warnings. And if you listen closely, you'll see reflections of this same poison in the world you live in today. Before we descend further into this tale, let me ask you this. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, because the ground you walk on, the streets in your own city, may hold stories just as dark, just as buried, just as forbid. So let us begin. Hartford, 1842, was a city standing on a knife's edge. On one side, old New England wealth, families who had built fortunes on shipping, insurance, and industry, families who guarded their reputations like crown jewels. On the other side, the tidal wave of Irish immigrants, laboring in mills and railroads, Catholic in faith, poor in possessions, but rich in determination to carve out a place in this new land. Two worlds colliding in the narrow streets of a growing city, and at the center of that collision was one woman, Eleanor Peton. Eleanor was no ordinary widow. She was a strategist, a social climber who had clawed her way from modest birth into the upper echelons of Hartford's elite. She had one son, William, and she had shaped him like clay. His education, his manners, his business dealings, all dictated by her iron hand. For Eleanor, William was not just a son. He was a vessel, the living extension of her ambition, and through him, the Peton name would endure, or so she thought. Then came Bridget O'Sullivan, 19 years old, Irish-born, the daughter of a widower who worked in Colt's firearms factory. She was beautiful, intelligent, and dangerous, not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. To Eleanor, Bridget was contamination, a foreign stain that would infect her carefully preserved world. And when William fell in love with her, Eleanor saw not romance, but betrayal, a threat to everything she had built. That is where the true story begins. Not with love, but with fear. Fear that turned to hatred, hatred that turned to calculation, and calculation that ended with poison. Men, ask yourself this. How many of history's darkest crimes were not born out of random madness, but of preservation? Of someone desperate to cling to power, to control, to the illusion that the world could remain theirs. Think of it as a mirror. Eleanor's story is not an antique curiosity. It is the same pattern that repeats in boardrooms, in politics, in secret council. Of power, a challenge arises, an outsider threatens the structure, and the hand that pretends to bless is the same hand that holds the knife. Hartford, in the autumn of 1842, was not a city of peace. On the surface, yes, the Connecticut River gleamed with commerce, steamboats carrying goods and dreams from New York, while factories roared and spat smoke into the sky. But beneath that progress lay a bitterness, a division that polite society dared not name too loudly. The Irish had come, and with them, fear. Fear from those who believed their status, their wealth, their carefully arranged order of things could be undone by foreign hands willing to work longer hours for less pay. The city's mansions looked out over streets where tenements festered, where Irish families crowded 10 to a room, where church bells from Catholic steeples clashed with the Protestant hymns that Hartford considered its birthright. And Eleanor Peton was listening. At Ladies' Aid Society meetings, behind the clink of porcelain teacups, she heard whispers of theft, drunkenness, insubordination, always attributed to the Irish. It is here you must understand. Hatred rarely declares itself as hatred. It cloaks itself as reason, as prudence, as concern for the future. Eleanor's hatred of Bridget O'Sullivan did not come in a flash of lightning. It was watered carefully by the whispers of her peers, by the dread of contamination, by the fear of her son's future slipping from her iron grasp. Now picture William, 23, tall, scholarly, handsome, the kind of young man Hartford society expected to marry within its own ranks, to extend the dynasty, to keep wealth and blood pure. But love is a rebellion of the soul. William had met Bridget not at a ball, not at a drawing room, but at a lecture. Ideas, not fortune, had bound them. She was radiant with intellect, articulate beyond her station, a girl whose very existence defied the label Eleanor wanted stamped on her. To William, Bridget was the future. To Eleanor, she was the apocalypse. Imagine the first time Eleanor realized the truth. A hot July afternoon, her lemonade sweating in a glass pitcher as she climbed the stairs to her son's office. Voices behind the door. A man's, William. A woman's, young, accented. The words that froze Eleanor's blood. I love you, Bridget. My mother will never accept this, but I don't care anymore. In that moment, Eleanor was no longer just a mother. She became something darker, an architect of destiny, a warden determined to keep her prisoner from escaping. This is where you must pay attention, because Eleanor's story is not just about a wedding gone wrong, it's about control. Ask yourself, who has shaped your choices without you realizing? Who has placed invisible chains on your decisions, telling you where to go, who to love, what to value? Eleanor was not unique. She was simply honest in her cruelty. She admitted to herself what others deny, that control is worth more than love, that power is worth more than happiness, and that if manipulation fails, destruction becomes necessary. Do you see the pattern? It is not only the story of a poisoned bride, it is the blueprint of how families, governments, even entire civilizations enforce obedience. They dress it as protection, as tradition, as order, but beneath it is always fear. Fear that someone else will take what they believe is theirs. Hartford society never suspected what Eleanor was becoming in those summer months. They saw only the gracious widow, the patron of charities, the wealthy matron presiding over dinners with flawless manners. But behind those grey eyes was calculation. Behind her smile was venom. She had already begun to imagine the girl's end. And men, here's where I tell you the truth that history rarely admits. Murder does not begin with poison. It begins with entitlement. Eleanor believed she owned her son, his choices, his life. And when ownership is threatened, destruction becomes a form of possession. Now, take a breath. Because the descent has only begun. William Peton had never lived a day of his life untouched by his mother's influence. To understand why he could not see the storm rising in her heart, you must first understand the prison Eleanor had built around him since birth. It was not a prison of iron bars. No, it was far more subtle, far more devastating. It was the prison of expectation. When William was a boy, Eleanor had whispered to him that he was destined for greatness, not as a dream, but as a command. She chose his tutors, oversaw every letter of his education, polished him like a diamond meant to be displayed. Every praise came with a hook. You are brilliant, William, but only because I have given you brilliance. You are strong, William, but only because I have forged your strength. Without me, you are nothing. This is the invisible chain of the manipulator, making love indistinguishable from control. Men, listen carefully, because every one of you has felt this at some point in your life. A parent, a boss, an institution, convincing you that your success belongs not to you, but to them. that your worth is borrowed, conditional, fragile. This is the oldest form of psychological slavery, and Eleanor was its master. When Jonathan Peton, William's father, died, the chain tightened. William was only 18, raw with grief, but Eleanor saw opportunity in tragedy. She stepped into the role of father, mother, and master all at once. The family fortune, $40,000, a sum that could shape empires in 1835, passed under her command, and with it, William's fate. From that moment, Eleanor did not raise a son. She engineered an heir. And so, when William fell in love with Bridget O'Sullivan, Eleanor did not see her as a rival woman. She saw her as a thief not just of her son's affection, but of her control, her legacy, her carefully preserved vision of the Peton name. She would have tolerated scandal, even ruin, but not disobedience. Disobedience was the one crime she could not forgive. Think of the conversations between them in those days, the ones polite society never heard. William, standing tall but hesitant, confessing that he intended to marry the Irish seamstress. Eleanor, listening with a smile so controlled it could have been carved in marble, while beneath it her mind calculated like a general at war. She did not argue immediately. No, she had learned that the most effective chains are not pulled, but loosened just enough to make the prisoner believe he is free. She told him she trusted his judgment. She told him she would love him no matter what. And in those words, she planted doubt. Here is the paradox of control. When it is most threatened, it becomes most tender. The abuser whispers affection not out of love, but as camouflage. Eleanor would wait until William was most vulnerable, until his guard was down, until Bridget's presence in his life felt unshakable. Only then would she strike, and her strike would not be against William directly. It would be against the woman he loved, the woman who symbolized his freedom. Do you see the brilliance of her cruelty? She would never confront her son outright. To do so would risk rebellion, sever the bond. Instead, she resolved to remove the threat quietly, decisively, in a way that would leave William broken and once again dependent on her. This is why the tragedy at Trinity Episcopal Church on October the 13th was not an act of madness but of design. Months before poison ever touched a chalice of wine, the plan had been written in Eleanor's heart. The method was only a detail. The true crime was older, deeper, hidden in the very fabric of her relationship with William. Men reflect on this. Control is never about love. It wears the mask of devotion, but beneath it is hunger. Hunger to possess, to dominate, to bend another life into your own design. And when hunger is threatened, it does not hesitate to devour. So, as we move deeper into this descent, ask yourself, where in your own life are you mistaking control for love? Where is the hand on your shoulder guiding you? Not because it wants you strong, but because it wants you weak. William could not see it until it was too late, but you must, because once the chalice is lifted, there is no turning back. The announcement appeared in the Hartford Courant on the morning of September the 15th, 1840, a few lines tucked neatly into the society column, but words that detonated like a cannon shot through Hartford's elite. Mr. William Peton, only son of the late Jonathan Peton, is engaged to Miss Bridget O'Sullivan, daughter of Mr. Patrick O'Sullivan of Hartford. There it was, in ink, no longer rumor, no longer speculation, a fact, unstoppable. The whispers began within hours, at tea tables, in gentlemen's clubs, in hushed corners of church vestibules, voices dripping with disbelief. An Irish girl, from a factory family, has William lost his senses? Some wrapped their shock in civility, others in sarcasm. How progressive of young Mr. Peton, one socialite murmured, her smile tight with venom. The truth was clear. William had broken the unspoken law. He had reached across the boundary dividing the old stock from the immigrants, and in doing so, dragged his family's name into the fire of gossip. And Eleanor Peton heard every word. At public gatherings, women leaned in close, offering congratulations laced with mockery. Their tones were always the same, half pity, half disdain. "I'm sure the girl is charming, Eleanor. How unusual, though, for William to make such a choice." These barbed compliments cut deeper than open insults. Eleanor, the master of composure, returned every smile, nodded graciously, and whispered her thanks. but inside, her rage sharpened into something crystalline. The Peton name, once unassailable, had become a spectacle. Understand this, for Eleanor, reputation was not vanity, it was power. In a society where connections opened doors, where alliances secured fortunes, reputation was currency. And now, through William's engagement, that currency was being devalued in real time. Every chuckle, every arched eyebrow, every whispered aside was a why. Withdrawal from the account she had spent decades building. Eleanor could not allow this hemorrhage to continue, so she studied Bridget O'Sullivan. She watched her at lectures, at cultural events, at walks along the Connecticut River. She wanted to find weakness, something crude, something clumsy, anything that would reveal the Irish girl as unworthy. But what she found unsettled her more than scandal would have. Bridget carried herself with quiet dignity. She was intelligent, curious, and unshaken by the subtle slights of Hartford's elite. Even Eleanor's own critics admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that Bridget had an elegance rare for her station. In Bridget's presence, William seemed transformed, more alive, more certain, more free, and that was precisely what Eleanor feared most. Because freedom is the enemy of control. Eleanor had not raised her son to be free. She had raised him to be hers, and Bridget had awakened something in him that Eleanor could not manipulate, could not cage. Love, in its purest form, is resistance, and to Eleanor, resistance was treason. But she was no fool. To oppose the engagement openly would risk pushing William further into Bridget's arms. To forbid the marriage would be to admit weakness, to expose her lack of control. No, Eleanor would not play the tyrant. She would play the strategist. She would wear the mask of tolerance, the mask of acceptance. Let society think she was gracious. Let William think she was softening. All the while she would move in silence, weaving the web that would end this union before it could ever be sealed at the altar. Here is where history shows us the deeper pattern. When institutions feel threatened, they never strike immediately. They observe, they adapt, they plan. They let the enemy believe he has won, until the knife comes from the shadows. The state, the church, the family, their strategies. These are always the same. A smile in public, a dagger in private. Eleanor began to gather information like a general assembling intelligence on a battlefield. Patrick O'Sullivan, Bridget's father, was reliable but outspoken about labor conditions at the factory. That was leverage. The O'Sullivans were Catholic, tied to Holy Trinity Church. That was scandal waiting to be weaponized. Bridget herself, well-liked, graceful, but still Irish, still vulnerable to the prejudices Eleanor's circle whispered about daily. All Eleanor needed was the right moment, the right method, the right poison, literal or social, to bring the entire edifice crashing down. So while William spoke of love and Bridget dreamed of a future, Eleanor smiled, nodded, and silently wrote their doom. And men never forget this lesson. When power feels threatened, it does not always roar. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it pours the wine. William thought he was free. That is the tragedy of this stage in the story. He believed that by announcing his engagement, he had broken his mother's chains. He mistook her silence for surrender, her politeness for acceptance. But men, you must understand this. The most dangerous moment is not when your enemy attacks, but when they smile and retreat. That is when the trap is being set. Eleanor began her campaign quietly, not with poison yet, but with words. Because words, when delivered with precision, can erode a man's conviction as surely as any toxin. She chose her moments carefully, always when William was tired, when his guard was down. A sigh at the dinner table, a wistful look at his father's portrait, a phrase spoken as if in passing. Your father had such high hopes for you, William, such hopes for the future of our family. She never mentioned Bridget directly. She didn't have to. Guilt is a sharper weapon than anger, and Eleanor wielded it with mastery. She also knew the power of isolation. The more William was drawn into Bridget's world, the less she could control him, so she began to subtly undermine his time. a sudden request for him to manage family business, a plea for his company at social functions, an illness that conveniently struck her when he was planning to visit Bridget, each demand framed as love, as need, as sacrifice. And William, bound by duty and the training of years, complied. Slowly, the hours he might have spent with his bride-to-be were swallowed by his mother's orbit. But Eleanor's strategy went deeper still. She began to weaponize society itself against the young couple. At gatherings, she allowed just enough whispers to reach William's ears. Friends expressing concern, acquaintances suggesting his judgment was clouded by passion. She did not argue with them. She thanked them, smiled, let their words take root. Doubt, once planted, grows quietly in the mind, and doubt was her greatest ally. Men, this is how control works. Rarely is it enforced by open chains. It seeps in as obligation, as guilt, as subtle pressure. It convinces you that you are acting freely, when in truth every step you take is guided by an invisible hand. Eleanor did not forbid William's marriage. She simply ensured that every path forward grew heavier, lonelier, more uncertain. Bridget, of course, saw through it. She felt the pull, the draining of William's strength, the way he returned from his mother's home looking troubled, his confidence shaken. She urged him to stand firm, to claim his own life, and here, for a moment, you see the true battle, not Irish against Yankee, not immigrant against elite, but freedom against control. Bridget's love gave William glimpses of independence he had never known. Eleanor's grip pulled him back into the prison he had mistaken for home. The war was silent, but it was merciless. Every smile from Eleanor was a blade. Every pause in conversation was a calculated test. And William, though he fought, was still a son, raised in dependency, trained to please. He was fighting not only his mother, but the very structure of his identity. That is the cruelty of such manipulation. It doesn't just attack your choices, it attacks your sense of self. And yet Eleanor was not satisfied. Words and isolation could weaken William, but they could not erase Bridget. The girl remained radiant, strong, impossible to discredit. Even whispers of her family's Irish roots failed to tarnish her in William's eyes. And so Eleanor's strategy darkened. If shame could not break them, if isolation could not divide them, then the girl herself would have to be removed. Not disgraced, not dismissed, removed. Think of that transition, men, the moment when resentment becomes resolve, the moment when control crossed, into destruction. It does not happen suddenly. It builds, layer by layer, until one day the thought that once seemed unthinkable becomes inevitable. Eleanor crossed that threshold in silence. By the winter of 1841, Eleanor's resolve had hardened into something unshakable. No longer was she merely resisting her son's rebellion. No longer was she content to whisper doubt, to manipulate hours, to lean on guilt. She had concluded in the silence of her parlor that Bridget O'Sullivan could not be permitted to live. Men understand this turning point. Evil does not usually erupt in fury. It is calculated, cold. It wears the mask of inevitability. In Eleanor's mind, this was not murder. It was preservation. Preservation of family, preservation of name, preservation of her own dominion over William. She convinced herself it was mercy, even a brief suffering for Bridget, to prevent decades of disgrace for the Petons. When a human being believes their cruelty is righteous, they become unstoppable. So Eleanor began to study, not in libraries where her presence might draw suspicion, but in whispers, in gossip, in the margins of conversations at charity luncheons. She lingered near physicians at social events, asking innocent questions about fevers, about remedies. She pried from apothecaries details about tinctures and tonics, disguising her curiosity as concern for her own health. Laudanum, arsenic, digitalis, these words, so clinical, became the vocabulary of her obsession. She discovered quickly that poison was the perfect weapon for a woman of her standing. It required no brute strength, no visible act of violence. It left no bloody weapon to be found, no witness to testify. A few drops, and the body itself became the scene of the crime. The victim seemed merely ill, perhaps weakened by fate, by providence. And what more fitting stage for such an act than a wedding? A day when every eye would be fixed on the couple, when wine would be raised in joy, when suspicion would be the last thought on anyone's mind. Yes, a wedding chalice. The symbolism was irresistible. The union itself poisoned literally by Eleanor's hand, not merely killing Bridget but erasing the marriage before it could ever be consummated. It was not enough for Eleanor to stop the wedding. She would turn it into a monument of her power. Meanwhile, to the outside world, Eleanor was the picture of propriety. She increased her donations to Trinity Episcopal Church, attended every service, ingratiated herself with Reverend Wainwright. She chaired charitable committees, sewing circles, and visiting societies. Every gesture of kindness was a disguise, a shield of respectability to hide the venom she was preparing. If anyone suspected her coldness toward Bridget, they dismissed it as the ordinary frost of class prejudice. No one imagined that beneath her lace gloves, she was sharpening the blade of death. And what of William? He noticed only that his mother seemed calmer, less resistant. She smiled when he spoke of Bridget, even nodded approval at their plans. For the first time in months, he felt hope. Foolish, dangerous hope. That is the cruelest trick of the manipulator, to lull you into comfort just as the noose tightens. William mistook his mother's silence for peace, when in truth it was the quiet of a predator crouching before the strike. Bridget, too, felt the shift. She sensed that Eleanor's hostility had cooled, but she was not naive. She told William she did not trust the calm, that there was something unnatural in his mother's sudden composure. But love often softens the edge of fear, and so, though her instincts screamed caution, she pressed forward with the wedding plans, determined to face whatever disapproval came their way. Men, reflect on this. How many times in history has silence disguised intent? How many times has a calm smile, a charitable act, a pious gesture hidden the architecture of destruction? Do not be fooled by appearance. The wolf does not always snarl. Sometimes it bows its head in prayer. By the spring of 1842, Eleanor Peton had everything she needed: the knowledge of poisons, the respect of her peers, the trust of her son, and the perfect stage for her performance, the altar at Trinity Episcopal Church. The chalice was waiting, and so was she. By the summer of 1842, Hartford was buzzing with anticipation. Weddings among the city's elite were always an event, a chance to parade wealth and status before watchful eyes. But the union of William Peton and Bridget O'Sullivan was more than a wedding. It was a spectacle, a scandal, a collision between two worlds: old stock Yankee respectability and Irish immigrant grit. The invitations, embossed and delivered with precision, were received with raised brows and murmured judgments. Yet no one declined. Curiosity is the most irresistible poison of all, and every guest longed to see for themselves how this strange union would unfold. Bridget prepared with a heart full of hope. She stitched the hem of her gown herself, her fingers trembling not from doubt, but from joy. To her, this wedding was not only a vow to William, it was proof that love could conquer barriers of class and prejudice. She dreamed of walking down the aisle not as an Irish girl from a crowded tenement, but as a bride, radiant, accepted and free. Her friends whispered caution, but Bridget believed in William, believed in their love. She was young, and youth has the dangerous gift of believing that love alone can rewrite the rules of the world. William was proud, perhaps even defiant. He walked through the streets with Bridget on his arm, daring Hartford's whispers to silence him. For once he felt like his own man, no longer tethered to his mother's dictates. The church they had chosen, Trinity Episcopal, gleamed with stone majesty, its Gothic arches promising solemnity and grandeur. William saw it as the place where he would finally claim his independence, where he would bind himself not to his mother's legacy, but to his own future. He had no idea that, within those very walls, Eleanor was plotting the erasure of everything he hoped to build. And Eleanor rehearsed her role with the precision of an actress. Outwardly, she played the part of the dutiful mother, overseeing details, speaking graciously of her future daughter-in-law, even praising Bridget's refinement in public. But in private, she imagined the scene to come. She pictured Bridget lifting the chalice, the sip of wine staining her lips, the faint smile fading into confusion, the color draining from her cheeks. She saw the collapse, the horror on the faces of the congregation, the chaos that would follow. She envisioned William's devastation, his brokenness, And in that brokenness, his return to her arms. It was not only a plan of murder, it was a fantasy of possession. Men, pause here. This is the nature of obsession. It does not stop at victory. It imagines the moment after, the sweet savor of domination, the intoxication of watching another's freedom collapse into your control. Eleanor's poison was not just chemical, it was psychological. She was already drinking it in her mind, sip by sip, with every rehearsal of the scene. As the wedding day approached, the city's divisions sharpened. The elite whispered their disdain, predicting disaster. The Irish community swelled with pride, claiming Bridget as a symbol of their resilience, their right to dignity in a land that scorned them. The church would not only host a wedding, it would host a war of appearances, a silent battle between prejudice and progress. Every guest would arrive not just to witness vows, but to witness history, and Eleanor would ensure that history ended in tragedy. On the eve of the ceremony, Bridget prayed for strength. William dreamed of liberation. Eleanor polished the family silver and arranged her lace shawl. Each of them believed the morning would bring resolute iron in one form or another. Only Eleanor knew the truth, that the morning would bring death. Men, take this lesson. While you celebrate, while you plan, while you dream, there may already be someone rehearsing your undoing. Evil does not always announce itself with threats. Sometimes it waits quietly in the pews, dressed in silk and lace, smiling as you walk toward the altar, and as the bells of Trinity prepared to toll, the chalice stood ready, waiting for lips that would never leave it alive. The morning of October 13th, 1842, dawned with a deceptive calm. The autumn air was crisp, the sky a cold, unbroken blue. From the highest steeple of Trinity Episcopal, bells rang out across Hartford, summoning the faithful and the curious alike. But this was no ordinary Sunday call. This was the call to a spectacle. The streets leading to the church filled with carriages and polished boots, ladies in silk gowns and bonnets, men in tailcoats and stovepipe hats, all converged, murmuring, whispering, straining to glimpse the union that had already stirred scandal long before the first vows. Inside the church, the scent of wax candles and pine boughs mingled with perfume and damp wool. The great stained-glass windows threw fractured light across polished pews, painting the guests in shards of crimson and sapphire. To some, it looked like holy light blessing the day. To others, it looked like a warning, as if even the heavens had cracked, watching what was about to unfold. William stood at the altar, tall, proud, but restless. His fingers flexed at his side. He had waited months for this moment, endured whispers, endured his mother's cold disapproval. Today he would stand as his own man. His heart raced not with fear but with anticipation. He had never felt more alive. And then, the sound, the shifting of the congregation as the doors opened. A hush fell. Bridget appeared, radiant in white, her auburn hair tucked beneath a simple veil, her emerald eyes glowing with a strange mixture of joy and innocence. She walked with a grace that silenced even her critics, each step down the aisle a defiance of every barrier that had been built against her. In that moment, she was not Irish, not immigrant, not seamstress. She was a bride, chosen and cherished. William's lips parted in awe. But Eleanor watched from her seat, spine rigid, hands folded neatly in her lap. Ease. Yes, fixed not on her son's joy, but on the chalice of wine placed beside the altar. She had arranged for its presence, had whispered to the officiating minister that the Peton family wished to honor tradition with a ceremonial sip. She had ensured the goblet passed through her hands that morning, polished to gleam, its contents already tainted with her careful calculation. And now she waited. She waited for the moment when her private rehearsal would become a public performance. The vows began, the exchange of promises, of rings, of words meant to bind two lives as one. The congregation listened, some with tears, some with envy, some with disdain, but all of them were witnesses. None of them could have guessed that they were also witnesses to murder. At last the minister lifted the chalice. His voice echoed in the vaulted chamber. As Christ shared the cup, so now do you, in union, share the blessings of life and love. He handed the goblet to the bride. Bridget's fingers trembled as she accepted it. Not from fear, but from the solemnity of the moment. She raised it to her lips, smiling faintly at William, but the smile faltered the instant the liquid touched her tongue. Her eyes widened, her throat constricted. She gasped. "The wine. It burns," she whispered, the words barely audible, but they reached the first pew. She staggered, the chalice clattering against the stone floor, its poisoned contents spilling like blood across the altar steps. Her body convulsed, her white gown twisting as she collapsed, foam gathering at her lips. Gasps erupted from the congregation, screams followed. William dropped to his knees, clutching her, begging, pleading. But her skin had already gone pale, her breath ragged and fading. Eleanor did not move. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask of frozen dignity, while inside she savored the fulfillment of her dark design, the sea. Hurt had become her theater, and death her instrument. Men, remember this moment. Joy can turn to terror in a single breath. What you believe is sacred can be corrupted by the hands of those closest to you, and the cup you raise in celebration may already be filled with poison. The church, moments before filled with reverent silence, erupted into pandemonium. The clang of the chalice echoed long after it hit the stone floor, a sound that seemed to reverberate into the very bones of every witness. Bridget lay sprawled in her white gown, her body convulsing violently, foam streaking the corners of her lips. Her emerald eyes, so full of life only seconds earlier, now darted wildly, pupils blown wide in terror. William knelt beside her, his cries shattering the sanctity of the altar. "Bridget, stay with me, stay with me." His voice broke, raw and primal. He pressed his hand to her cheek, then her throat, desperate for signs of life. But her body jerked beneath his touch, rigid as if seized by invisible hands. The sound of her nails scraping against the stone floor made the nearest guests flinch in horror. The minister stood frozen, his holy book trembling in his grip, words failing him. Mothers clutched their children. Men stepped back as though poison itself might leap from the bride's body and claim them too. A low moan of confusion rolled through the pews, followed by a scream, shrill, piercing, undeniable. The chaos swelled, a tide of panic breaking against the solemn walls of Trinity. "Fetch a physician," someone cried. Feet pounded against the aisle as a young man sprinted into the street, but even the swiftest horse in Hartford could not outrun the venom already coursing through Bridget's veins. Every heartbeat was a death drum, every gasp dragged her closer to silence. William shook, clutching her with trembling arms. His tears fell into her hair, his words a frantic litany. "You'll be all right, my love, you'll be all right. Please, God, please." But God, if he listened at all, was silent. And through it all sat Eleanor, still, composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lace shawl perfectly arranged. To the casual eye, she looked like a woman paralyzed by grief, her dignity intact in the face of tragedy. But her eyes betrayed her. They did not linger on Bridget's suffering. They watched her son. They measured the cracks breaking across his soul. This was not mere satisfaction. It was possession, the slow, terrible satisfaction of reclaiming what she had nearly lost. The whispers began before Bridget's body went still. A matron in the third pew hissed, "It was the wine." Another clutched her pearls, eyes darting to the shattered chalice at the altar steps. She said it burned. A voice quivered from the front row. Fear turned quickly to suspicion. Suspicion turned to quiet accusation, but none dared speak the full thought aloud. Who would poison a bride on her wedding day, and in God's own house? Bridget's final breath came with a sound that silenced the church entirely. A ragged sigh, her chest falling one last time against William's desperate hands. He pressed his lips to hers, sobbing, but there was nothing left to save. The bride was gone. The wedding had become a funeral. Men, burn this into your memory. Every crowd becomes a jury. They watched a young woman collapse, and already their minds stitched together a story. Stories become rumors, and rumors harden into truth long before evidence can be spoken. And when suspicion circles the altar, it rarely leaves until blood has been accounted for. Eleanor finally rose, slow and deliberate, placing a handkerchief to her lips as if to stifle her own grief. but her voice carried clearly across the stunned silence. "My poor son." With that, she moved toward William, laying a steadying hand on his shoulder as if he too were broken by the tragedy. To all watching, it looked like a mother's embrace. To Eleanor, it was a reclamation. Her son was shattered, and shattered men are easiest to control. The bells of Trinity tolled outside, unaware of the horror within. Each peal fell like a judgment, not a celebration, but a sentence. The congregation poured out into the streets, spreading the news before Bridget's body was even lifted from the floor. By nightfall, all of Hartford would know. By dawn, all of New England would whisper, "The bride is dead." The church emptied that day as if fire had broken out. Guests spilled into the streets, their silks and fine hats disheveled, faces pale with shock. But the true blaze was not of flame. It was of rumor. Within hours, Hartford buzzed with tales of the poisoned bride. By nightfall, innkeepers whispered it to travelers, seamstresses murmured it over their needles, and factory men carried it into taverns like contraband. Bridget O'Sullivan had died at the altar, her final words a cry of burning wine. No one needed to be told twice what that meant. Poison. Bridget's body was taken to her family's modest home on Front Street, where her father, Patrick, collapsed beside her lifeless form. He had crossed the Atlantic with 4 children, endured loss, hunger, and prejudice, believing America promised better. Now, as he stroked his daughter's cold hand, he realized the truth. America could be crueler than the island they had fled. He wept not only for Bridget, but for the bitter fate that had followed them across an ocean. William refused to leave her side. For 3 nights he stayed in the small parlor where her coffin rested, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. Neighbors whispered that he spoke to her still, whispering promises to the dead. Grief hollowed him, stripped away the proud young man who had stood at the altar days before. What remained was a husk, a son broken by forces he could not comprehend. And yet, as grief tore through William and the O'Sullivans, Eleanor played her role to perfection. She dressed in black, her veil heavy, her steps slow. She appeared in public with downcast eyes, speaking softly of our terrible loss. To society, she looked like a mother robbed of a daughter-in-law, a victim of fate's cruelty. But behind closed doors, her mask slipped. In the dim light of her mansion on Prospect Street, she studied the newspaper reports with a cold satisfaction. Each line carried her design forward, suspicion growing, talk of poison uncontainable. The more tongues wagged, the deeper the story sank into Hartford's soul. But whispers began to drift toward her as well. She never wanted the marriage, some muttered. Did you not see how calm she remained? Others asked. People remembered her composure, the way she had sat so still while chaos raged around her. A few daring voices speculated what no one dared say aloud at the church, that a mother might kill to preserve her legacy. Yet without proof, suspicion was smoke, and Eleanor knew well how to control smoke, by directing it toward others. The first suspect, naturally, was Bridget's own family. They were Irish, Catholic, outsiders in a Protestant stronghold. Rumor painted them as schemers, whispering that perhaps Bridget had enemies among her own kind, or that some ancient feud had followed them from Ireland. Eleanor encouraged such talk subtly, never directly. A single sigh at a tea gathering, a comment that Bridget had looked unwell in the weeks before, a carefully chosen remark. The poor girl. One wonders if something from her own home did not agree with her. Each word dripped into the city's ear like venom. Meanwhile, Hartford demanded answers. Physicians examined Bridget's body and found clear signs of poisoning. They traced the source to the chalice, though the residue was faint. The minister swore it had been prepared by Eleanor herself at her insistence. Yet who would accuse one of Hartford's most respected widows outright? The thought was dangerous. Safer to suggest other possibilities, a jealous Irish suitor, a careless mistake, even divine punishment. Men, remember this. Institutions rarely accuse power directly. They protect it, circle it, make excuses for it. Truth is bent until it no longer threatens those who hold the highest seats. In Hartford, Eleanor's wealth and name stood like armor. While Bridget lay in her coffin, Eleanor remained untouchable. The funeral was held with solemn ceremony. Hundreds attended, drawn by morbid curiosity as much as grief. William, pale and hollow-eyed, nearly collapsed as Bridget's coffin was lowered into the earth. Patrick O'Sullivan clenched his fists, glaring across the crowd at Eleanor, as though he sensed the truth his tongue could not prove. And Eleanor, draped in black, accepted condolences with calm dignity, each word of pity another stone in the fortress she was building around herself. The bride was buried, but the poison lingered, not only in her blood, but in the city's veins. Hartford had tasted something it would not forget, something darker than scandal, something forbidden. The days after Bridget's burial were thick with unease. Hartford's polite facades, its parlours and churches and marketplaces, hid a city gnawing at itself with questions. People had seen her collapse. They had heard her dying words. Poison was not speculation anymore. It was fact. The question was who and why, and in that silence between certainty and accusation, rumours bred like vermin. The coroner's report confirmed what the whispers had already decided. Bridget O'Sullivan's stomach bore the unmistakable signs of arsenic. The poison had entered her bloodstream swiftly, mercilessly. Death was inevitable the moment the chalice touched her lips. It was not an accident. It was design. That word, design, spread through Hartford like a curse. Design meant intent. Intent meant a hand behind the chalice, and when people thought of hands that had touched the cup, only one name carried weight: Eleanor Peton. But to accuse Eleanor directly was to challenge the very scaffolding of Hartford's social order. She was old money by reputation, though her roots were merchant-born. She hosted the governor, funded the church, kept the Peton fortune alive after her husband's death. Eleanor was not just a woman, she was an institution, and institutions, men, have always been guarded by silence. Still, silence cracks. The minister admitted reluctantly that Eleanor had insisted on handling the wine herself, a detail noted, then buried under polite explanation. She wished only to preserve a family tradition, he told officials. Friends repeated her words of grief, her veiled weeping, but others remembered her composure, the cold stillness of her posture as Bridget writhed. To some, it looked like strength, to others, like calculation. William remained paralyzed in grief, blind to the web tightening around him. He spent hours wandering the cemetery, his boots sinking into damp as he stared at the stone marking Bridget's grave. His mind turned in circles. What if he had delayed the wedding? What if he had refused the chalice? What if love had been enough to protect them? Guilt gnawed at him until he barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of her face, pale, convulsing, whispering, "It burns." Eleanor seized her opportunity. She tended to her son like a dutiful mother, preparing meals he did not touch, sitting silently in his study while he stared at cold hearths. She whispered to visitors that William was not himself, that grief clouded his judgment, and in that narrative she was the patient, suffering mother. Yet behind her veil of care, she pressed the investigation's gaze elsewhere. She dropped careful words into the right ears. Perhaps Bridget's family had brought enemies from Ireland. Perhaps a jealous Catholic suitor had objected to her marriage to a Protestant. Perhaps Bridget herself had unknowingly consumed something toxic before the ceremony. In every suggestion, Eleanor steered suspicion away from her house. The O'Sullivans, poor and Irish, were far easier targets, and Hartford's elite were eager to believe that poison belonged to outsiders, not their own. Men, see the pattern. Power always seeks the weak to carry its sins. The guilty drape themselves in mourning clothes while pointing toward the poor, the foreign, the voiceless, and society, desperate for comfort, accepts the lie. Because to admit the truth, that evil may sit at the very center of power, is to unravel the whole fabric of order. But not everyone accepted it. Patrick O'Sullivan, hollow-eyed from grief, began to speak more boldly. He told neighbors he had seen Eleanor's calmness. He told friends that his daughter had been murdered not by fate, but by a woman who despised their name. His word spread among the Irish workers who muttered in taverns and dead kitchens that the Yankee widow had killed Bridget to keep her out of the family. What began as whispers grew into anger, anger into certainty. The city now stood divided. Hartford's elite shielded Eleanor, unwilling to tarnish their own ranks. The Irish poor rallied around Patrick, sharpening their outrage into a blade. William, caught in the middle, drowned silently in grief, blind to the gathering storm. And Eleanor, calm as ever, sat in her parlour, sipping tea with steady hands. Behind her veil of black lace, she smiled. The investigation was closing in, but she knew something the rest of Hartford had yet to learn. Truth is fragile, and with enough pressure, it can be bent until it serves power, not justice. By November of 1842, Hartford no longer spoke of anything else. The city's shops, taverns and churches carried only one story, the poisoned bride of Trinity Church. It was as if the event had become part of the city's blood, circulating through every vein, feeding gossip, fear and outrage. Every mention of wine, every clink of a goblet, every whisper of arsenic stirred the memory anew. The Irish spoke openly now, anger breaking through their usual caution. At Murphy's Tavern on Front Street, men cursed Eleanor's name over mugs of ale, declaring her a murderess who hid behind silk and wealth. Women at the pump repeated Bridget O'Sullivan's words as if they were scripture. "She killed my daughter." By lamplight, children were told the story as warning. A Yankee widow with a heart of stone, striking down an Irish bride at God's own altar. Among Hartford's elite, the whispers were more restrained, but they were whispers nonetheless. Over tea, ladies murmured that it was odd how calm Eleanor had been during the chaos. At the club, merchants debated whether arsenic could have been hidden in Bridget's gown or slipped to her by some jealous suitor. They bent themselves into knots to explain the inexplicable, for to accuse Eleanor outright was to threaten the very social fabric that held them together. William lived as if suspended between these worlds. He heard the rumours on both sides, but his heart could not bear to examine them closely. His grief was still too raw, his love too fresh in his memory. He wandered the cemetery, leaving flowers until the earth above Bridget's grave became a garden. His health waned, cheeks hollow, skin pale, and yet, as days stretched into weeks, small fissures of doubt began to form in his mind. One evening he returned from the graveyard to find Eleanor in the parlour, seated by the fire with a serenity that chilled him. She looked up from her embroidery and asked softly, "Did you speak to her again today?" Her tone was tender, but William saw something in her eyes he had not noticed before, a glimmer, sharp and watchful. For a moment he felt like the object of an experiment. He shook the thought away, ashamed. This was his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had shielded him after his father's death. To doubt her was unthinkable, yet Bridget's last words gnawed at him. "It burns." He remembered the chalice, the way his mother had insisted on its presence, the way she had moved with such calm while Bridget writhed at her feet. Still, he buried his doubts in silence. To speak them aloud would make them real. Eleanor, sensing his weakness, pressed her advantage. She encouraged him to avoid the O'Sullivans, warning that their grief had turned to bitterness, that they blamed him unfairly. She urged him to remain in the house, away from public eyes, assuring him that gossip would pass with time, and though her voice was gentle, her words carried chains. Slowly she bound him to her side, his world shrinking to the walls of Prospect Street. Yet outside those walls, Hartford boiled. The Irish held vigils by Bridget's grave, their candles burning defiantly against the night. Their anger grew, not just at Eleanor, but at a city that seemed eager to protect her. They saw in Bridget's death a mirror of their own struggle, their labour exploited, their faith scorned, their lives deemed cheap compared to the wealthy few. Her grave became a symbol, and symbols, men, are more dangerous than facts. The investigation sputtered in the face of influence. Physicians could prove arsenic, but not the hand that delivered it. Officials interviewed, but dared not accuse. Justice staggered beneath the weight of Eleanor's name, and through it all, she moved with perfect poise, veiled in mourning, her reputation broken. But even Eleanor knew that cracks were forming. The Irish were restless, William was faltering, and Hartford itself seemed to hold its breath. She had silenced Bridget forever, but she could not silence the city. Not yet. By December, Hartford had become a city divided not by streets, but by suspicion. The The case of Bridget O'Sullivan's death hung over every shop counter, every pulpit, every street corner where men gathered to smoke and whisper. The air itself seemed poisoned, heavy with blame and fear. The Irish community's anger grew bolder. No longer content with tavern murmurs or whispered laments at the pump, they marched openly to Bridget's grave in candle-lit processions. Whole families walked, holding hands, their hymns echoing through the frosted night air. Some carried placards painted with words that bit deep. Justice for Bridget. Others spat Eleanor's name aloud, calling her the poison widow, the witch of Prospect Street. Their grief had hardened into defiance. Hartford's elites recoiled. They called the vigils disturbances, the placards disrespectful. To them, the Irish were not mourning, they were agitating. Letters to the local paper denounced foreign mobs stirring unrest. The city's constables were dispatched to watch the gatherings, though they did not interfere, yet the sight of armed men shadowing their grief only deepened Irish resentment. It was tinder waiting for a spark. William felt the pull of both worlds. He could not deny Bridget's people their sorrow. He had loved her too deeply, but each time he ventured near their vigils, he felt his mother's eyes on him, her voice in his ear. They do not mourn her, William. They use her. They twist her memory to strike at us. He wanted to believe her, yet when he saw Patrick O'Sullivan standing by his daughter's grave, face drawn with grief, he knew those words were lies. Patrick's pain was real, raw, unshaped by politics. William felt it like a mirror of his own. Doubt gnawed at him more fiercely now. He began to recall details he had once pushed aside, the way Eleanor had handled the chalice, the calmness of her face while Bridget died, the subtle glimmers in her eyes that spoke of something more than grief. At night, as he stared into the cold grate of his fireplace, he wondered, could his mother have done it? The thought was a knife he could not bear to hold long. Each time it cut too deep, he threw it from his mind, only for it to return sharper the next day. Eleanor sensed the shift in him. She watched her son with the precision of a chess master watching a pawn wander from its square. His silences grew longer, his eyes sharper, his steps slower when he crossed the parlor where she sat. She knew suspicion when she saw it, and William was beginning to suspect. That realization chilled even her. For all her composure, Eleanor understood the danger of doubt. A son's loyalty was her shield. If that shield cracked, all Hartford's whispers might finally find their mark. She redoubled her performance. More tender words, more feigned frailty, more displays of motherly suffering. She let the household staff see her weep into handkerchiefs. She ensured visitors overheard her sigh for Bridget's memory. She wrapped herself in grief like armor. And yet, when the house was quiet, her thoughts darkened. If William pressed his suspicion further, if Patrick's voice grew louder, if the Irish grew bolder, the control she had fought so hard to preserve might slip from her hands. She had silenced Bridget. She could silence again. Men, take heed. Those who wield poison rarely stop at one cup. The taste of power, once proven effective, becomes too sweet to abandon. The same hand that delivers a bride's death can deliver another's, a father's, a son's, a rival's. And each time it strikes, it grows more certain, more untouchable. On a bitter winter night, Eleanor stood at her parlor window, watching snow gather on the street. In the distance, faint and haunting, she heard the Irish singing by Bridget's grave. She tightened her shawl, lips pressed to a thin line. The city was slipping, her son was slipping, and whispers were sharpening into threats. Control, she told herself, must be reclaimed, even if it meant more blood. The new year did not bring peace to Hartford. Snow crusted the rooftops, but beneath the quiet lay a restless heat, an anger that seemed to radiate from the O'Sullivans' modest home and ripple outward into the streets. Patrick O'Sullivan had begun to speak more openly. At taverns, in churches, even in the shadow of the courthouse, his voice rose with a father's fury. "My daughter did not die by God's hand, but by a hand that feared her." He did not name Eleanor directly, but everyone knew whom he meant. The words spread quickly, taken up by others, carried through alleys and mills until Eleanor's name became a hiss in the mouths of laborers and immigrants. Hartford's elite countered with their own whispers. They said Patrick was bitter, unstable, drunk on rage and grief. But even they could not drown the sound of the Irish hymns that grew louder, night after night, at Bridget's grave. William found himself drawn to those gatherings, walking at a distance where the shadows swallowed him. He watched the candles flicker against faces hardened by mourning. He saw Patrick's hands tremble as he clutched his rosary, lips moving in prayers that broke on his breath. Each time William felt the weight of guilt press harder on his chest. He should have protected Bridget. He should have seen what his love had awakened, not only in her heart, but in his mother's fury. Eleanor noticed his absences. She noticed, too, the way his questions sharpened. "Why did you stand so calmly that morning? Why did you not rush to Bridget's side?" She answered with wounded dignity, but she felt his eyes burrowing deeper into her mask. The balance was shifting. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the faint tremor of losing control, and in her mind the solution was clear. If William's heart could not be reclaimed, if Patrick's voice could not be silenced by shame or ridicule, then something more permanent would be required, and Hartford, already trembling on the edge of riot, would provide perfect cover for another quiet death. Eleanor moved like a shadow through her own home, every gesture calculated, every silence a mask. To the world, she remained the grieving matron, draped in widow's black, clutching handkerchiefs damp with staged tears. But inside, her mind turned with the cold precision of a clockwork engine. She began quietly gathering information. Which apothecaries sold powders without too many questions? Which servants were careless with the wine cellar? Which doctor's word could be persuaded, if the need arose, to call a sudden death natural? These were not wild questions for her. They were steps in an old, familiar dance. Meanwhile, William grew restless. He had taken to wandering Hartford streets alone at night, listening to tavern talk, scribbling notes in his journal. The son of privilege was becoming an investigator in spite of himself. He asked discreet questions about poison, about rare substances that could burn a throat the way Bridget's last words described. Each answer pointed to a narrow circle of possibilities, a circle that seemed to close around his mother. Patrick O'Sullivan, too, sharpened his fight. He petitioned local officials for an inquiry, urging them to exhume Bridget's body. The request was denied, too scandalous, too disruptive, but the very act planted new rumors in the city's bloodstream. Eleanor watched all of this unfold with icy calm. Suspicion was no longer a distant threat. It was at her doorstep. Her son's doubts, Patrick's persistence, the Irish unrest, they pressed against her walls like floodwaters. So she made her choice. If William could not be turned back to her side, if Patrick could not be silenced by ridicule, then the solution must be absolute. She would not hesitate. She had killed once to protect her family's legacy. She would do it again. William was not a man trained in suspicion, but grief had sharpened him. He began to notice details that once would have slipped past, the lingering scent of bitter almonds when he entered his mother's study, the way she dismissed servants suddenly after years of loyalty, the discreet parcels delivered to the back door by men who never stayed long enough for conversation. One evening, restless and unable to sleep, he passed by her chamber and saw a sliver of light beneath the door. He paused. Through the thin wood came the faint scrape of glass, the rustle of paper, the clink of a spoon stirring liquid. His hand hovered near the latch, but he did not enter. Instead, he memorized the sounds. Sounds of preparation, sounds of intent. The next morning, he searched discreetly. In a locked drawer of his father's old desk, hidden behind yellowed contracts, he discovered a small pouch. Inside, a fine, pale powder that stung his fingers with the faintest burn. His heart pounded. He had read enough to know what it meant. Poison. Waiting. Ready. It was then that realization struck with brutal clarity. His mother's war was no longer against Bridget. Bridget was gone. The war had shifted, and now he stood in the way. Every moment in her presence became unbearable theater. Her smiles stretched too wide, her touch lingered too long. At dinner, when she offered him wine, his throat tightened. He thought of Bridget collapsing, the foam at her lips, the burning cry that still echoed in his nightmares. He pushed the glass aside. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, not much, only a flicker, but enough to confirm what he already knew. The battle had begun. And in Hartford streets, unrest swelled. If he did not act soon, the next death would not be whispered about in parlors, it would be his own. William moved cautiously, each step shadowed by the awareness that his own mother might now see him as expendable. He could no longer confide in the household staff. They answered to her first, nor could he approach Hartford's officials. Too many were tied to Eleanor through debts, favors, or shared prejudice. If he accused her without proof, they would laugh at him, then carry word back to her. That alone could end him. So he turned to the only place left, the streets where Bridget's name still carried weight. One evening, cloaked against the cold, William walked toward the Irish Quarter. Smoke curled from tenements, and voices spilled from taverns alive with grief turned defiance. There, among the noise, he found Patrick O'Sullivan. The older man's face had aged a decade in mere months, but his eyes still burned. When William approached, Patrick's fists clenched at his sides. "You've no right here," Patrick said, voice low and trembling. "Your family brought my daughter to the grave." "I know," William answered, steady though his chest tightened. "And I believe it was my mother's hand that delivered the poison." The words stunned Patrick. For a long moment he only stared. Then, slowly, suspicion gave way to grim curiosity. "You'd speak against your own blood?" "I would," William said, "because if I remain silent, I will follow Bridget into the ground. And so might you." That night, in the back room of a tavern, thick with pipe smoke, William laid out what he had found. The powder, the sounds in the night, the change in his mother's gaze. Patrick listened, jaw tight, knuckles white against the table. When William finished, the Irishman leaned forward. "Then we fight together," Patrick said. "But make no mistake, this is more than family now. This is Hartford itself. If she falls, the mask these people wear falls with her." William nodded. In that smoke-filled room, two men bound by loss forged an alliance, one of blood, grief, and dangerous purpose. Eleanor felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Whispers no longer died when she entered a room, and her son's silences had grown heavier, more deliberate. He carried himself with a quiet defiance, as if some unseen force braced his spine. Someone was feeding his courage, someone was moving against her. By late January, reports reached her from loyal acquaintances. William had been seen in the Irish Quarter, his figure unmistakable even beneath a cloak. Worse, he had been seen with Patrick O'Sullivan himself. That alliance struck Eleanor like ice water, the father of the dead girl and the son she had raised conspiring together. It was betrayal doubled, and a threat that could not be ignored. Her first instinct was fury, a fire so consuming she nearly stormed into William's chamber that night to end it then and there. But she mastered herself. Fury was loud, precision was silent. She knew the rules of survival. You never strike while anger blinds you. You wait, you prepare, and you choose the perfect moment. She began arranging dinners again, inviting Hartford's most influential families, men whose businesses depended on her investments, women whose reputations she could ruin with a single whispered secret. At these gatherings she spoke softly of William's fragile state, suggesting grief had unmoored him. She sowed the seeds of doubt before he ever had a chance to speak against her. Privately, her preparations darkened. The pouch of powder was not her only weapon. She inquired discreetly about tinctures, about volatile substances that could mimic illness or accident. Each question framed with careful innocence, but each designed to arm her with options. And in her mind, a plan began to take shape. If William and Patrick thought themselves allied, then perhaps they should be taught a lesson, together. A single stroke delivered at the right moment could silence both men and remind Hartford who truly commanded its fate. William and Patrick met in secret, huddled in cold back rooms where candlelight flickered against bare wood. Each meeting carried risk. If Eleanor's eyes and ears discovered them, they would not live to see spring. Yet necessity bound them together. Their plan was simple, yet dangerous. They would gather evidence, then bring it not to the officials Eleanor controlled, but to the people. Patrick would rally the Irish, William the disillusioned youth of Hartford, and together they would force the truth into daylight, where even Eleanor's influence could not smother it. William spoke of the powder he had found, of the night sounds from his mother's chamber. Patrick promised sworn statements from Bridget's friends and fellow workers, testifying to Eleanor's hatred and threats. Piece by piece, they were constructing a weapon, not of blades or bullets, but of truth sharpened into accusation. "We cannot wait much longer," Patrick said. "Her power grows with each day we delay. If she suspects us—" "She already suspects," William replied grimly. "I see it in her eyes. She is planning something. We must move first." Unbeknownst to them, Eleanor was indeed planning. She had chosen the day, a gathering at her home where wine would flow and Hartford's leaders would bear witness. To them, it would appear as fate or illness. To her, it would be the perfect elimination of both threats at once. The stage was set, two sides preparing their strike, and only one would survive the collision. The night of Eleanor's gathering arrived beneath a pale winter moon. Prospect Street glittered with carriages, the city's elite streaming into her home, unaware that death itself hovered in the parlor. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter rose, and Eleanor moved among her guests with regal calm, a silver tray of wine glinting in her hands. But William was ready. He had slipped the pouch of powder from her desk days earlier, hiding it in his coat as proof. Tonight, he would confront her publicly, before Hartford's most powerful eyes. Patrick, waiting among the servants with allies, was prepared to surge forward if Eleanor denied the charge. When Eleanor raised her glass for a toast, William's voice cut through the chatter. "Stop! Do not drink!" The room froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. He stepped into the center, his hand trembling as he held up the pouch. "This," he said, voice echoing, "was hidden in my mother's drawer, the same poison that burned Bridget's throat. The same hand that offered it, then offers it again tonight." Gasps rippled. Patrick stepped forward, his grief hardening into testimony. "She murdered my daughter, and now she means to murder her own son." Eleanor's mask cracked, if only for a second. Her eyes blazed with fury, lips curling as if to strike him with words sharper than blades. But it was too late. The room no longer saw a grieving matron. They saw the witch of Prospect Street, caught with poison in her hands. History did not record her reply, only that Hartford's most powerful families left her house in silence, their allegiance broken. Men, remember this: power built on fear will always devour itself. Poison does not stop with one victim. In the end, it turns on its maker,